She was my teacher, but what I learned from her was never in the lesson plan. I never thought staying after class would change the way I saw her. It was supposed to be something ordinary, just me, helping my teacher stack papers and straighten the rows of chairs. But that evening carried a quiet energy, the kind you don't notice at first but feels settle under your skin, like warmth spreading through you on a cold night. The classroom was almost empty now, the last footsteps of other students fading down the hall. All that remained was the faint scratch of chalk still clinging to the air, and the scent of dry erase markers and old books. The windows were half open, letting in the late afternoon breeze, and the blinds rattled softly against the glass. She stood at the desk, gathering up a stack of lesson plans. Her movements were graceful, precise, the kind of effortless poise that only comes with time. At 42, she had the confidence of someone who had carried herself through 1,000 ordinary days, yet there was something quietly vulnerable about her too, like a secret she never let slip. "Thank you for helping," she said, her voice calm but carrying that low, steady warmth I'd come to recognize. I shrugged, smiling. "It's nothing. I don't mind." And I meant it. Maybe I enjoyed it more than I should. Watching her tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, seeing the way her sleeve brushed across the desk, it was all strangely mesmerizing. At one point, as I handed her a folder, our fingers touched. Just for a second. But it was long enough. It wasn't the kind of touch that's loud or obvious. It was subtle. The briefest meeting of skin on skin, yet it lingered in my mind like a spark waiting to catch flame. I noticed the warmth of her hand, softer than I expected, and the slight hesitation before she let go. We both laughed softly, though either of us said why. The air shifted between us, charged with something we couldn't name. She looked at me then, not as a teacher glancing at a student, but as a woman who had momentarily forgotten the lines drawn between us. Her eyes lingered, thoughtful and searching, like she was trying to understand why this moment felt different. For the first time, I noticed the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, marks of a life lived fully, not flaws. They gave her beauty a kind of depth, like a painting that tells more the longer you look at it. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge that silence. But the words didn't come. So instead I just smiled. And she smiled back. It was a small thing. Just a curve of her lips, nothing dramatic. But it felt like a secret shared only between us. The room suddenly seemed quieter than before. The ticking of the wall clock sounded louder, and even the shadows on the floor felt sharper. It was as though the world had slowed down, leaving only the two of us standing there, holding on to a moment that should have passed but didn't. I don't know if she realized it, or if she forced herself to look away before it could grow into something more. She cleared her throat, shifting back into her usual tone. "You'd better get going," she said, stacking the last of the papers with unnecessary precision. "It's late." I nodded, though I didn't move right away. I caught one last glimpse of her as she turned toward the board, erasing a line of notes from the day's lecture. That was when it hit me, this wasn't just about admiration anymore. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't in the lesson plan. But somehow, it was by accident that I ended up back at her door that night. I had left my notebook behind, a small thing, but important enough that I found myself retracing my steps long after the halls had emptied. The building was nearly silent now, the kind of silence that makes every creak of the floor echo, every breath feel heavier than it should. Her classroom door was half open, a faint glow spilling out into the dark hallway. I paused, debating whether I should knock or just slip in quietly. But before I could decide, her voice called out, "You're still here?" I pushed the door open. She was seated at her desk, glasses perched lightly on her nose, the lamplight pooling around her like a soft halo. She looked up at me, and there was something different about her expression, gentler, less guarded. "I left my notebook," I said, holding up my hands in surrender, as though I'd been caught in some harmless crime. She smiled, that calm, knowing smile of hers. "Come in, then." I stepped inside, retrieving the notebook from where it sat on a stack of graded essays. When I turned back, she was watching me, chin resting lightly on her hand. "It's late," I said, trying to sound casual. "Don't you ever take a break?" Her laugh was soft, a little tired. "Breaks aren't really in the lesson plan." I don't know what compelled me, but I blurted out. "Maybe the best things aren't." Her eyes flickered at that, just for a moment, but it was enough. She leaned back, exhaling as though I'd touched on something she wasn't expecting. Then, after a pause, "Would you like some tea?" I hesitated, but only for show. The truth was, I didn't want to leave. Not yet. We ended up in the small office adjoining her classroom, a quiet little space cluttered with books, plants, and the faint scent of lavender. She poured hot water into two mismatched mugs, the steam curling upward in delicate swirls. The rain had started outside, soft and steady against the windows, filling the silence between us with something almost comforting. We sat across from each other, the desk lamp casting shadows that moved gently across her face. She looked different here, not just a teacher, not just authority, but a woman. A woman with thoughts, regrets, and dreams that stretched far beyond the chalkboard. Our conversation began lightly, comments about the storm, a joke about how students never read half the material assigned. But slowly it drifted into something deeper. She told me about the cities she once dreamed of living in, the books she always meant to write, the choices she sometimes questioned late at night. I listened, not just with my ears, but with the kind of attention you give when you know every word matters. And when it was my turn, I admitted things I rarely said out loud. That I wasn't sure where I was headed. That I felt like I was always chasing something just out of reach. That sometimes I felt older than I was, and other times impossibly young. Her eyes softened then, a quiet recognition passing through them. She didn't try to fix my words or offer advice. She just understood. When I passed her the notebook I'd come for, our fingers brushed again. Only this time neither of us moved away right away. The warmth of her skin against mine felt deliberate, unhurried. For a moment, the rain outside, the tick of the clock, the dim hum of the fluorescent lights, all of it faded. There was only her. She pulled her hand back at last, setting the mug down with a faint clink. But the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged. Alive. We sat there, two people separated by years and titles, yet connected by something we couldn't quite name. That night, as I left her office, notebook in hand, I realized this was no longer just a spark. It was a fire, quiet but growing. And deep down, I knew, it wasn't going to burn out. The next day, the air in the classroom felt different. It wasn't colder, but there was a distance in it, a space carefully drawn, invisible yet impossible to ignore. She stood at the front of the room, speaking in her usual calm, steady tone. But I could hear it, the slight formality that hadn't been there last night. Every word was measured, every movement just a little too precise, as if she were building walls between us with her voice. And I understood why. She was my teacher. I was her student. There were rules, expectations, reputations to protect. Last night had been something else. A pause in the usual order. A glimpse at something fragile and unplanned. Now, here in the bright fluorescent light of the classroom, she was doing what she had to do, pretending it hadn't happened. But pretending doesn't erase the memory. When she walked down the rows to check our notes, I felt her presence before I saw her. The faint scent of lavender again. The quiet sound of her heels against the tiled floor. She paused at my desk. Her hand hovered for just a second over the paper, as if she might adjust it, might let her fingers graze the edge like before. But then she pulled back, her hand retreating quickly, too quickly. "Good work," she said softly. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes betrayed her. I looked up, and for a split second, our gazes locked. There it was again, that same searching look from last night, the kind of look that makes time stutter. But she broke it almost immediately, glancing toward the next desk as though nothing had passed between us. It should have ended there. But it didn't. All through the lesson, I caught her glancing my way. Not often. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I noticed. Of course I noticed. The way her eyes flicked up mid-sentence, lingered for half a heartbeat too long, and then darted away again. And I realized she wasn't just avoiding me. She was fighting herself. I wasn't angry. If anything, I admired her for it, for her sense of duty, her instinct to protect not just herself but me as well. But I couldn't stop the frustration from curling in my chest, the ache of wanting to say, "You don't have to pretend." Not with me. The bell rang, and the usual rush of footsteps filled the air. Students packed up quickly, eager to escape. I stayed behind a moment, slower than the rest. She noticed. Of course she did. "Is there something you needed?" she asked, her tone polite, distant. I almost said yes. Almost asked if we could talk. Almost confessed that last night had left me thinking about her more than I wanted to admit. But instead I just shook my head. "No, nothing." She gave a quick nod, already turning to erase the board. Her arm moved with careful precision, each sweep of the eraser purposeful, like she was trying to wipe away more than just chalk. I stood there for a second longer, watching her, before finally stepping out. In the hallway, the noise of the world returned, students laughing, lockers slamming, the ordinary rhythm of a day moving on. But my mind was still back in that classroom, stuck on the image of her holding herself at a distance, fighting against the pull between us. It wasn't rejection. I knew that much. It was fear. And the hardest part wasn't that she was afraid of me. It was that she was afraid of herself. The corridor was almost empty when I found her there. Classes had ended hours ago, and most of the building had gone quiet. The faint hum of the overhead lights echoed against the walls, and each step I took sounded louder than it should have. She was leaning against the wall near the faculty office, arms folded loosely, her gaze lost somewhere in the middle distance. For a moment, I just watched her, caught in the stillness of her silhouette, the way the fading daylight brushed soft shadows across her face. When she noticed me, she straightened quickly, her usual composure snapping back into place. But her voice betrayed her. "You shouldn't still be here," she said, softer than usual. I smiled, trying to mask the nerves building in me. "Neither should you." Her lips curved faintly, but she didn't answer. Instead, she glanced down the hallway, as if making sure we were alone. We were. I don't know what gave me the courage, maybe the memory of her laugh last night, or the way she kept looking at me in class earlier, like she couldn't decide whether to hold me close or push me away. But I took a step closer. "Can I say something?" I asked. Her eyes flickered, uncertain. "That depends." I swallowed, my words carefully chosen, dancing just on the edge of truth. "I think some of the most important things in life, they don't fit into any lesson plan. They just happen. Unexpected. Unwritten." Her breath caught, subtle, but I noticed. She leaned back against the wall again, arms folding tighter now, like a shield. "You really shouldn't say things like that," she whispered, though there was no edge in her tone. More like a plea than a warning. I let the silence stretch, watching the faint tremor in her fingers as she adjusted her sleeve. The quiet between us wasn't empty. It was charged, alive, heavy with all the words either of us dared to say outright. "Why not?" I finally asked, my voice low. She shook her head, a small, almost helpless laugh escaping her lips. "Because you don't understand." But I did. At least I thought I did. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't blind to the way she looked at me, or the way I felt whenever she was near. I wanted to confess that last night hadn't left me, that it had followed me into my dreams, into every quiet thought I'd had since. But instead, I only stepped closer. Not too close, just enough so she could feel my presence, so the space between us grew smaller, narrower, harder to ignore. Her breath quickened, though her expression remained composed. She tilted her head slightly, meeting my gaze. And in her eyes I saw the war she was fighting, the pull of responsibility against the ache of something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. "I shouldn't be having this conversation," she murmured. "Maybe not," I admitted. "But we are." She closed her eyes briefly, exhaling slowly. When she opened them again, there was no anger, no reprimand. Only vulnerability. "You're too young to understand how complicated this is," she said, but her voice wavered on the last word. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't rejecting me. She was protecting herself, from me, from the world, from the possibility of something real. The hallway stretched on around us, empty and still, the faint flicker of the overhead light buzzing softly. And yet, it felt like the world had narrowed to just us, her pressed lightly against the wall, me standing inches away, both of us speaking in riddles because the truth was too dangerous to say out loud. But in her eyes I saw it. And in my silence she felt it. It wasn't a confession spoken outright. But it was one all the same. It started innocently enough. A late-night study session, just her helping me review for an upcoming exam. The classroom was empty, quiet, except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the rustle of papers between us. She sat close, closer than usual, leaning over the desk as we went through my notes. Her perfume, light, floral, familiar, clung to the air, mixing with the faint scent of ink and chalk dust. For a while, everything stayed professional. Her voice calm, steady, explaining concepts, correcting small mistakes. But then, little by little, the tone shifted. The pauses between her sentences grew longer, her glances lingering a little too much. At one point, she reached across me to underline a passage. Her hand trembled slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but I noticed. The pencil slipped in her grip, and without thinking, I reached out. My hand covered hers. It wasn't planned. It wasn't bold. It was instinct, gentle, almost protective. But once my skin touched hers, once I felt the warmth of her hand beneath mine, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. The silence that followed was deafening. We both froze, staring down at our hands, then slowly, hesitantly, lifting our eyes to each other. Her expression was conflicted, caught between fear and something deeper. The faint rise and fall of her chest betrayed her breath unsteady. She didn't move her hand. Not at first. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, like the walls themselves were leaning in, waiting for what might happen next. For a moment, nothing else existed. Just the heat of her skin under mine, the unspoken truth pressing between us. Then she whispered my name. Not stern. Not scolding. But fragile, almost breaking. The kind of whisper that sounded like a plea. My heart pounded, but I didn't let go. Not right away. "I know," I said quietly, though I wasn't even sure what I meant by it. I just knew it was the only thing I could say. Finally, she pulled her hand back. Slowly. Reluctantly. The loss of that warmth left my palm cold, empty. She turned her face away, eyes fixed on the scattered papers as though they might save her from whatever had just passed between us. Her voice, when she spoke again, was strained but steady. "We shouldn't," she began, but the words caught in her throat. She tried again. "This can't." I wanted to answer, to tell her that I understood, that I wasn't trying to push her into something she wasn't ready for. But instead I stayed silent, because silence felt more honest than any excuse could be. The rain had started outside again, tapping softly against the windows, filling the silence she couldn't bring herself to break. She gathered the papers with trembling hands, her movements too fast, too forced, as though the act of cleaning up might erase what had just happened. But nothing could erase it. Not for me. When I finally stood, ready to leave, she looked up, just for a second. Our eyes met, and in that brief, unguarded moment, I saw it clearly. The longing. The fear. The part of her that wanted to reach out just as much as I did. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. But the silence between us that night spoke louder than anything either of us could have confessed. It was the kind of silence you can't unhear. The kind that lingers, pressing against your chest long after the moment has passed. And in that silence I knew we had crossed a line. Even if we pretended otherwise, there was no going back. The next time we spoke, she wasn't the same. Gone was the calm, untouchable composure she wore like armor. Instead, she looked tired. Not physically, but in the way her shoulders carried the weight of something unspoken. It was late again, later than it should have been for either of us to still be there. The classroom was dim, lit only by the small desk lamp she kept on, casting a soft glow across the room. Outside, the campus was quiet, swallowed in evening shadows. She sat at the desk, her hands folded tightly, her gaze fixed on them as though they might hold the answers to questions she hadn't dared to ask. I lingered at the door, unsure if I should intrude, until she finally spoke without looking up. "Close the door." Her voice was low, steady, but there was a tremor beneath it that I'd never heard before. I obeyed, the faint click of the latch sounding louder than it should have. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then she sighed, pressing her fingers to her temple. Whatever is happening between us," she began, her voice faltering. "It's not simple." I stepped closer, careful, giving her space but not letting the distance grow too wide. "I know." She lifted her eyes to mine then, and for the first time, I saw them unguarded. Not the teacher's gaze, measured and composed, but a woman's. Vulnerable. Afraid. Longing. "I can't pretend I don't feel it," she admitted, her words barely above a whisper. "But I'm terrified. Terrified of what it means, of what people would say, of what it might do to you, to me." Her confession hung in the air, trembling with honesty. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I studied the way her hands twisted together, the way her chest rose and fell too quickly, the way her lip trembled before she bit it back. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "I don't see you as just my teacher. I see you. You've taught me more in the past weeks than any textbook ever could. About choices, about strength, about honesty." Her eyes glistened, a single tear slipping free before she could stop it. She turned her head away, embarrassed, but I stepped closer still. And then, without asking, without overthinking, I reached up, brushing that tear away with my thumb. Her breath caught at the touch. She didn't pull back. The warmth of her skin beneath my fingers sent a shiver through me, but I kept my hand gentle, steady. It wasn't a bold move. It wasn't a demand. It was a promise that I could hold her vulnerability without breaking it. For a moment, she let herself lean into that touch. Her eyes closed, her shoulders softening just enough to reveal the exhaustion she carried. "You're too young to carry this weight," she whispered, her voice raw. "Maybe," I admitted. "But I want to carry part of yours. If you'll let me." Her eyes opened, locking on mine. The silence that followed was unlike the silence from before, not heavy, not painful. It was softer, tender, filled with all the words we couldn't yet say but no longer needed to. I lowered my hand slowly, but the connection lingered, unbroken. That night, there were no dramatic confessions, no rushed declarations of love. Just two people sitting in the quiet, finally admitting what they had tried so hard to hide, that the line between us had blurred, and neither of us could deny it anymore. For the first time, she wasn't my teacher. She was simply her. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never see her the same way again. The air was different the next day. Not in the way the weather shifts, or the way a room feels when the lights are dimmed. This was deeper. An unspoken awareness, a gravity between us that neither of us could ignore any longer. Classes went on as usual. She spoke with the same authority, guiding us through literature as if nothing had changed. But I noticed the way her gaze lingered a second too long when it drifted my way. I noticed the faint catch in her breath when our hands brushed as she passed me a paper. To everyone else, it was an ordinary day. To us, it was something entirely different. When the final bell rang, the other students hurried out, eager for freedom. I stayed back, pretending to pack up slowly, waiting. She looked at me once, a fleeting glance, before stacking her books and carrying them to the desk. "You're not leaving?" she asked, her tone light but cautious. I shook my head. "Not yet." There was a pause, long enough for the quiet between us to fill with meaning. Then she sighed, gesturing for me to close the door again. The click of it felt familiar now, like a ritual that marked the beginning of honesty. She leaned against her desk, arms crossed loosely, not in defense but in thought. Her eyes softened. You know this isn't supposed to happen. I nodded. I know. And yet, she trailed off, searching for words. Here we are. I stepped closer, not recklessly, but with the steadiness of someone who understood the weight of the moment. I don't want to pretend anymore. Her lips parted as if to answer, but no words came. Instead, she pressed a hand to her chest, as though steadying her own heartbeat. You have no idea how dangerous this could be, for both of us. People talk. They assume. And I've lived long enough to know how harsh they can be. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and that alone unraveled the last of my hesitation. Then let's not give them anything to talk about, I said softly. Let's just give this a chance. Between us. Quietly. Honestly. Not as teacher and student, but as two people who found each other when we weren't supposed to. For a long, suspended moment, she studied me. Every doubt, every fear flickered across her face like shadows. And then, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders eased, as though she had finally surrendered to something she could no longer fight. She reached out, hesitant at first, then let her fingers brush against mine. That simple touch was enough to change everything. Her hand fit into mine, warm and trembling, and she didn't pull away. I don't know where this will lead, she admitted, her voice quiet, vulnerable. But I do know I haven't felt this alive in a very long time. I tightened my hold, gentle but firm. Then let's start there. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, small but radiant, like a crack of sunlight breaking through a storm. We didn't kiss, not yet. That would have been too much, too soon. Instead, we stood in that dim classroom, holding each other's gaze, our hands entwined. And in that silence, everything we hadn't said out loud was spoken. It wasn't about defying rules, or chasing something forbidden. It was about connection, unexpected, undeniable, and fragile in the most beautiful way. By the time I finally left the room, the night had settled outside. The hallway was quiet, the campus nearly deserted. But I carried something with me that hadn't been there before, the certainty that I wasn't just her student anymore. We had crossed the line. Carefully. Tenderly. Irrevocably. And whatever came next, we would face it, together. 25L.